This evening, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University, I am very pleased to welcome noted editor and historian Daniel Okrent. He joins us to discuss his new book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. Last Call is a most compelling narrative history that explores the crucial political and social ramifications of what is known as the Noble Experiment, delving into how exactly Prohibition happened and what it did to our nation. Vanity Fair calls the book, quote, both a cautionary tale and a hilarious history, with an inebriating mix of rum runners, moonshiners, and general mayhem. And a Wall Street Journal article entitled Temperance Tantrum calls Okrent's book a superb look at a rollicking and sordid period in the country's history. Daniel Okrent has been called one of our most interesting and eclectic writers of nonfiction over the past 25 years, and in his 40-year career has encompassed nearly every form of mass media. He was the first public editor of the New York Times, editor-at-large of Time, Inc., and managing editor of Life magazine. He has worked extensively in book publishing and is the author of 4 other books, one of which, Great Fortune, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Mr. Okrent has appeared in several films and documentaries, and according to the beautifully designed website, danielokrent.com, he has talked more than any other talking head in Ken Burns' documentary, Baseball. He'll also be featured in another Ken Burns documentary, this one on Prohibition, next year. On a more local note, Mr. Okrent was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where he remains an associate. And we are so thrilled to have him here in Cambridge with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Daniel Okrent.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see so many old friends who came out tonight. I hope they won't be insulted when I say I'm even more delighted to see people I've never seen before, which for a writer on book tours is really a rare and wonderful experience. I'll begin with a little bit of the history, how I came to write this book. My last book, that kind of collection, was called Great Fortune, the Epic of Rockefeller Center, a history of Rockefeller Center. The 3 square blocks in Midtown Manhattan, where Rockefeller Center was built, had been the speakeasy belt of Manhattan. That's where there were more speakeasies than anywhere else for a variety of reasons. It was 228 old brownstones. They were speakeasies and brothels and flop houses. And the Rockefeller interests had to acquire the ground leases to these 228 pieces of property. And so I went, as a researcher will, into the municipal archives in New York to find out how they did it, how they get this one, how they get this one, how they get this one. And I kept on running into these speakeasy owners who had more political clout than the Rockefeller family. That led to saying, wow, there's a book here. Obviously not a book about the speakeasy owners of Midtown Manhattan, but about this extraordinary, phenomenal, unlikely, impossible to believe period of nearly 14 years when the Constitution said that people could not legally get alcoholic beverages. The Constitution, I think we all know, is really a document that indicates, puts limits on government, what government cannot do. It only restricted, at any time in the entire history of the Constitution, it only restricted individual behavior in 2 ways. You couldn't own slaves, according to the 13th Amendment, and for 14 years you couldn't legally acquire alcoholic beverages. This is an equation that doesn't quite fit. So the title, I wanted to call the book, How the Hell Did That Happen? My publisher thought that would be a little intemperate and probably not the right thing to do. Instead, I found myself disappearing for nearly 4.5 years into the research into this period, and constantly, repeatedly stunned by what I learned. I thought I knew something about the period going in, and I knew almost nothing at all. How did it happen? The very, very short version. This country was drowning in liquor in the 19th century, in the early and middle 19th century. People drank for every possible reason, every possible excuse. One of the primary reasons was water was really lousy. The boat that John Winthrop came over in 1630 to the Massachusetts Bay Colony had more beer in its hold than water. The drinking accelerated in the early part of the 19th century as people moved toward the frontier. Every household had a barrel of cider by the door. And then hard liquor was distilled in every corner of the young republic. In 1830, the average American over 15 years of age drank the equivalent of 7.5 gallons of pure alcohol a year, which is, in our terms, 90/5 of 80 proof liquor. That's nearly two bottles a week. And that, if you consider that there were a lot of people who didn't drink at all, those who were drinking were really, really drinking. Why were they drinking? They drank because they were happy. They drank because they were sad. They drank to make deals. They drank when deals fell apart. In large cities, at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., the grog bell went off, and that was time to take not a coffee break or a tea break, but the grog break. George Washington gave the soldiers in the Continental Army a 4-ounce ration every day. That continued until the 1830s. In the words of the historian W.J. Rorabaugh, writing about 40 years ago, Americans of that period drank from the crack of dawn till the crack of dawn. The consequence of this, among many consequences, the worst consequence was the way that women and children suffered. Drinking was not by any means a male sport particularly, but the saloon, the tavern, was a male-only refuge, and it was a refuge for some who wanted to get away from the responsibilities of their lives. Men would go and get terribly, terribly drunk. They would spend the mortgage money. They would come home and they would hit the wife and the children. They lost their land. They lost their jobs. They brought home something that was known in the era as syphilis of the innocent. A lot of the saloons were attached to brothels, and the men would pick up venereal disease, bring it home, and infect their wives with it. At the time, American women had virtually no legal rights or property rights. There was nothing they could do about it. And this drove many women, beginning in the 1840s, to campaign for temperance, as the term was at the time. Among those women was Susan B. Anthony, who began as a temperance worker before she was a suffrage worker. And she attended a convention of the New York State Sons of Temperance in 1849 or 1850, I'm not remembering exactly when. And she rose to speak, and she was told by the person chairing the event that she could not speak, that only men were allowed to speak of this. And this is what drove Anthony into the suffrage movement. And the suffrage movement was really fueled by this need that women felt that without the legal rights that they could only attain by acquiring the vote, they would never be able to deal with these other problems that were brought about by the omnipresence of liquor in their lives. So these two movements really progressed together. The suffrage movement and the Prohibition movement, and the two amendments, the 18th Amendment authorizing prohibition and the 19th authorizing universal suffrage, they enter the Constitution within 1 year of each other. It was an alliance of both conviction and to some degree of convenience. The people who opposed women's suffrage more than anyone else were the Brewers. The Brewers were extremely powerful politically. In 1869, the U.S. Brewers Association passed a resolution saying that we must oppose women's suffrage everywhere and anywhere, because they knew that it was more likely that women would be voting against alcohol than men would. It turned out to be an incredibly stupid thing, among the many, many stupid things that the Brewers did, that by so publicly opposing the vote for women, they were guaranteeing that women would oppose them. The greatest illustration of this, in my mind, took place in 1911, when there was a ballot in California, a statewide ballot on women's suffrage. And Jack London, who really knew how to drink and who had always opposed women's suffrage, he was living in his ranch in Sonoma County. And he got on his horse one day and he rode down into the valley to vote. And as he said in his memoir, he had a few drinks before he voted, he had a few drinks after he voted, he rode his horse back up to the ranch, and he told his wife that he had voted for women's suffrage. And she was stunned. He had never indicated that he was for women's suffrage. And she asked why, and he said, because I know that when women get the vote, they will vote to close the saloon. And if they close the saloon, I'll be able to stop drinking. He wanted women's suffrage so that he could get sober. So in any case, this was the primary movement that made it happen, and then there were two other things that had nothing directly to do with prohibition that made the amendment possible. The second one was the income tax. Going back to the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s, the federal government had been dependent upon the taxes that could be taken from the bottle of liquor. In the 1860s, Lincoln authorized a tax on beer, which really financed much of the Civil War, and the two became tied one to another, that the consumption of liquor produced revenue for the federal government, to such a degree that by 1910, in some years, as much as 40% of federal revenue came from the excise tax on alcoholic beverages. This was, in the terms of one prohibition worker, a bribe on the public conscience. You couldn't get rid of liquor and still have a government. In 1898, the distillers realized that this was really, they stopped complaining about the tax, that the Spanish-American War was to a large degree financed by liquor taxes, and the distilling industry understood that this was a way that they could preserve their own privileges to produce their liquor, so long as they could demonstrate this patriotic devotion to producing tax for war. Along around the same time, in the 1890s, the Supreme Court declares the first income tax voted on by Congress to be unconstitutional. And this begins a movement to create a constitutional amendment for the income tax, led by William Jennings Bryan, who happened also to be a leader of the Prohibition movement. And he brought together these two groups. The Prohibitionists supported the income tax because they knew that they had to have a substitute source of revenue if they were ever going to get rid of alcohol, because of the alcohol tax. And vice versa, the Populists supported Prohibition as a part of a political quid pro quo. In 1913, the 16th Amendment is ratified, and immediately thereafter, the Prohibitionists, they determined to stop fighting the state-by-state battles that they had been fighting and say, now that we can do this, we can have a constitutional amendment. The third thing that happened that put it over the top was World War I. In World War I, a few things happened, including a very activist government, government taking a much larger role in people's lives and people getting used to that. But more importantly, all the brewers, and the brewers are the real villains of the story, much more than the distillers. The brewers, they all had last names like Schlitz, Pabst, Anheuser, Busch, Schmidt, Rupert. They were all German, and it was very easy for the leaders of the Prohibition movement to demonize them and to say, these people are working in the service of the Kaiser. These are our enemies. They are doing anything they can to sap the morale of the American people. They're using foodstuffs, grains, to make their vile beverages rather than to make bread for the starving Belgians. And on this continued. And the incredibly intense anti-German feeling that was stoked by the parties of war, they were dead. Their goose was cooked. And it took the 36 state legislatures who were needed to ratify the amendment as passed by Congress. It took them barely a year to do it, and that was because of World War I. The other thing that was going on that's related to that was a very strong anti-immigrant feeling. The Prohibitionist movement was an interesting coalition. It was everybody from the Ku Klux Klan to the Progressive Party. But in the heart of the Prohibition movement were the Baptist and Methodist, native-born white Americans of the Middle West who saw that they were losing their country to these foreigners who were occupying the cities, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, other Eastern and Southern Europeans. As the immigrant population in the cities grow, they are getting much greater representation in Congress, and there is a battle, whose country is this? It was very similar, I think, to what we're experiencing today, not just on the immigration issue, but on any number of issues where you take a stand-in issue, as I think Prohibition became for many people, a stand-in issue like, say, same-sex marriage. It's really not about same-sex marriage. It's about whose country, who does this belong to? So 1920, it finally arrives. It's put in place. I should stop for a moment to talk about Wayne B. Wheeler, the man who was the combination Karl Rove, David Plouffe, James Carville, the genius behind the Prohibition movement, who, when he died in 1927, the Washington Post said, when the history of our time is written, the first name that will be mentioned is that of Wayne B. Wheeler. How many people in this room or in this state have ever heard of Wayne B. Wheeler? He was you've heard of Wayne B. Wheeler? You're the first one I've met. You went to Oberlin. Well, it's a very good point. Wheeler went to Oberlin was a place. It was created on reform. It was abolitionism. It was vegetarianism. It was all the reform movements of the 19th century came out of Oberlin. Wheeler was a political genius. There was never anything resembling a majority for Prohibition in this country. There were many minorities that he could put together, these different groups, but mostly he controlled things at the margins. So if you have an election where 45% of the people are for the Republican and 45% of the Democrat, and you control 10% because of one issue, you decide who wins the election. And if you were running for office at that time, and you were for the rights for women and better education and preserving the landscape and all the wonderful things, and you were against Prohibition, they wouldn't have anything to do with you. And if you were for murdering the firstborn child in every household, but were for Prohibition, they would support you. I'm obviously exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating a lot. It was the only thing that mattered. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had been the leader of the Prohibition movement, Frances Willard, the leader of that group, she had gotten a lot of issues involved in it. They campaigned for many things, and almost on a social welfare program, but the Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League, his organization, said, we care about this one thing only. So in 1920, the one thing arrives. And in the beginning, drinking does go down. It goes down quite a bit. But then people realize a week or two later that they can really get their liquor. And there were several ways of doing it, and I'll read about one of them momentarily. But the three There were three exceptions that were built in to the Volstead Act, which was the enforcement legislation that put teeth into the Prohibition Amendment. The first exception was medicinal uses of liquor. And those of you who've spent any time on Venice Beach in California recently and seen people with signs that say, "I'm a doctor, get a prescription," this had its roots back in the Prohibition era. You could buy a prescription for $3 from a physician and then take it to your pharmacy and have it filled for another $3 and go home with a pint of liquor every 10 days. Now, for what ailments? In 1917, while the Prohibition Amendment was on its way to enactment and to ratification, the American Medical Association House of Delegates voted unanimously that it had no role in the pharmacopoeia at all and that there was no real use for it, acceptable therapeutic use. And then, once they realized that this thing was there and they could make a living out of it, the AMA did a survey of its members in 1922, a referendum on medical uses, and found 29 ailments that could be treated by the timely use of alcohol. They range from cancer and diabetes to my favorite, old age. So, and I'm sure it was very effective for those things. So this became, I have a bottle at home. I have this lovely bottle, a pint-sized bottle of Jim Beam for medicinal purposes only. And this became an enormous business. In 1926, a freight train carrying 54,000 pints of Old Forester bourbon for medicinal purposes left the Howard Street distillery of Brown-Forman Corporation in Louisville and came to Boston. Who are the customers in Boston? The drugstores, the drugstore chains. There's a photograph in this book of a price list from S.S. Pierce, our own S.S. Pierce, the carriage trade wholesalers. This is a price list for alcoholic beverages for physicians and dentists only. Now, it comes in, there are 10 different varieties, and there are 6 different brands, and it was really a wonderful thing for the medical profession. They were able to do that. The second approved use was something that Wheeler had put into the Volstead Act because he needed the support of the farm country. The farmers and their families were essential to the support of Prohibition. And farmers back from the time of the beginning of the Republic, and particularly in the Ohio Valley after Johnny Appleseed went around spreading his apples, they had gotten very used to having their hard cider. I always thought, the Johnny Appleseed, what was it, Golden Delicious or Macintosh or something like that? No, it was strictly an apple that could be used to make hard cider. Hard cider could be turned into Applejack. It was an essential part of life on the frontier, or deemed as such. So that was accepted as well under a clause that said it enabled the farmer to preserve fruit juices. Well, the other consequence of the preservation of fruit juices was the creation of an enormous industry of shipping grapes from California east to the primarily to the cities with large ethnic populations in the east and the Middle West, to such a degree that you could go to the San Francisco freight yards during October during the harvest, and you would see people buying a freight car full of a particular grape that shipped well called Alicante, and then selling it to the next guy who sold it to the next guy, and we sold 5 times before it even left the yard. In New York, outside of New York in Jersey City, the Pennsylvania Railroad had to double the size of its freight terminal simply to handle this traffic. And you could go into any ethnic, particularly Italian neighborhoods in any large city in October, and the smell of the grape pomace hung over the air. It was inescapable. And people were allowed to make up to 200 gallons for their own personal use and not to be able to sell it. Well, of course, some people sold it as well. The third use was for sacramental purposes. Now, the Catholics and the Jews, almost to a man and woman, opposed Prohibition. There was one small organization, Catholic organization, that was for Prohibition, run by a man named Callahan from Kentucky, who at a congressional hearing was asked by the wet senator who was grilling him, how many members does this group have? And he said, 320. And how many Catholics are there in the United States? 18 million. So it didn't carry the day. The part that I'm going to read, and I promise you it's brief, is about a man named Georges Delattre, who founded Beaulieu Vineyards, which remains one of the leading vineyards in the Napa Valley. In 1912, before Prohibition, Delattre had gotten what's called an ecclesiastic approbation from the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Northern California. That was the thing that allows you to sell sacramental altar wines directly to priests across the country. So with that in hand, he had already started a business. And then in 1918, seeing that Prohibition was coming, he not only began to transfer the grapes that he was growing to a kind that would, to a variety of kinds that would serve his business well. He also made a deal with the Wente brothers of the Livermore Valley, another familiar name, to buy their entire production every year because they were the masters of a particular kind of grape. So I will read what happens from there. When he made his deal with the Wentes, he would end up purchasing the family's entire production for the full 14 years. Delattre was placing a bet on the sacramental wine business. It did not take long to start cashing in. Just before Prohibition began, he hired Charles W. Fay, a political operative who had been San Francisco postmaster throughout the Wilson administration and had continued to play a prominent role in California politics during the 1920s. Soon Delattre was granted, in March 1920, that's 6 weeks after Prohibition begins, the Prohibition's permit number California A1, allowing him to make, ship, and sell sacramental wines. That same month, Archbishop Edward Hanna of San Francisco congratulated him on the rapid growth of his business. By 1922, Delattre had distributors in 7 eastern and midwestern cities, in addition to his headquarters in San Francisco. The next year, he began buying up large tracts of vineyard land and all the grapes that came with them, including a large piece acquired directly from the Diocese of Northern California. By the middle of the decade, he was storing 900,000 gallons of wine in a vast new building that covered more than an acre in Rutherford, and shipping prodigious quantities via a rail spur running up the Napa Valley that the Southern Pacific had opened expressly to handle his business. To many, this seemed like an awful lot of communion wine. Prohibition Bureau records indicate that occasionally wine warehoused by one of Beaulieu's wholesalers would go missing, and although Ernest Wente was certain that Delattre always played by the rules, he also believed he chose to look the other way when Beaulieu's production fell into what Wente called illegal channels. It didn't have to fall very far, for Delatre's church business lay not only with the priests whose signatures were required by law and order forms, but implicitly with their congregations as well. When a priest took receipt of an order for, say, 120 gallons of BV, Beaulieu, a not uncommon amount, he suddenly had an inventory of 46,000 communion sips, more or less, or perhaps 10,000 communion sips with nearly 100 gallons set aside for members of the congregation. Sometimes the wine didn't even leave the rectory. In 1932, 6 cases of Beaulieu's best were shipped to Chicago expressly for the use of Cardinal George Mundelein. I advise priests to buy a large quantity at a time, for instance, a half barrel or a barrel, Delattre told E.C. Yellowlee, the second-ranking man in the Prohibition Bureau. Delattre explained that bulky shipments made in transit theft more difficult. He did not explain that they also made post-delivery allocation a lot easier. Beaulieu's wines were put into circulation beyond the altar by the irresistible physics of the era, that form of gravity that deposited potable alcohol in the cupboards of people whose need was not particularly spiritual. But one historian who praised Delatre's ability to move a lot of wine without the trouble and expense of actually having to market it wasn't looking very closely. In the promotional materials Delattre sent out to priests across the country, the message of the Eucharist, "Whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life," seemed less central than the message of the market. I have had many favorable comments on your wine and personally consider it to be of the very best produced in California. Read a testimonial from Archbishop Hanna that Delattre reprinted in one of the Beaulieu brochures. Photographs of the vineyards and descriptions of the winery, sheltered by the foothills of the Coast Range Mountains, lent sales materials an aroma more commercial than ecclesiastic. So did the product offering, which suggested a connoisseurship one doesn't necessarily associate with the communion rail. In 1921, Delattre was offering Sauterne, Chablis, Riesling, Cabernet Sauvignon, Tokay, Sherry, Angelica, Burgundy, Port, and Muscatel. Before Prohibition was over, he had added Madeira, Malaga, and Moselle, as well as a blend he called Beaulieu's Special. But Delatre's most brilliant marketing gesture was the construction of a guest cottage for visiting clerics and a standing invitation to any who wished to visit Beaulieu and test the wines on the spot. Other Delattre guests included political figures and Hollywood celebrities, but as pleasing as those visitors might have been, they were mere signifiers of the Delattre family's stature. The priests who came to Rutherford materially contributed to it. The guest cottage was built deep into the vineyard, next to the family's summer residence, a sprawling 6-bedroom wooden structure decorated inside with Louis XVI furniture and outside with verandas, gardens, one Italian and another French, a rooftop bell imported from Florence, and one of the first swimming pools in Northern California. Invited to join the Delatres for dinner, how could Father Meyer of Milwaukee or Monsignor Brody of New York or Bishop Cantwell of Los Angeles or any of the hundreds of other churchly guests who made the pilgrimage to Rutherford consider any other communion wine? If any clinching was needed, Delattre had provided the perfect environment for closing the sale. There on the veranda, shaded by a grove of sycamores, the lush rows of vines gleaming in the distance, he had built an altar where the visiting priests could commune with the blood of Christ under circumstances that could place even an atheist in the grip of ecstasy. Just as a footnote to that, in 1929, Winston Churchill, who with his son Randolph was taking a tour of Canada and California, you can imagine what Winston Churchill thought about Prohibition. He called it an affront to the entire history of mankind. But they stop, and they're guests, they're overnight guests of the Delattres. And in the guest book, Churchill wrote, "A moment's halt, a momentary taste." Their host, Churchill wrote to his wife Clementine, had over 1 million gallons stored in his factory, which was a goodly sight to see in this dry land. His son Randolph, in his diary, was more elusive. He wrote, "Christ has come to the aid of Bacchus in a most wonderful way." That's only the start of it. That's only the beginning of it. The story of how the Jews handled the sacramental wine it's very complicated and doesn't lend itself to the quick reading of this. But suffice to say that Congregation Talmud Torah in Los Angeles had 180 families in 1920. A year later, after Prohibition had been around for a year, it had 1,000 families. Because there was no church hierarchy for Jews, because really anybody who claimed to be a rabbi could say he was a rabbi. There was no one to say that you aren't a rabbi, and there was no formal distribution system the way that the Catholic Church had. So we began to have wine congregations, and they became known as such, and things began to appear in the newspapers constantly about rabbis operating out of a small room on the Lower East Side and distributing 10,000 gallons of wine in a week or two. There's a photograph in here of a store on the Lower East Side, of a wine store with big jugs in the window, and a sign that says for sacramental purposes only. And this wasn't your typical Shabbos, let me tell you. It was the sacramental wine, the Jewish sacramental wine business really got destroyed by very, very bad press and reading constantly. This was, as they say, this was bad for the Jews. And the Reform rabbis, they made the case that it was not necessary to have fermented grape juice for the Sabbath services. You could simply do it with fresh grape juice. And this led to the doctrinal war between the Orthodox and the Reform Jews that was really quite ugly, not happy at all. The Orthodox finally gave up around 1925 or 1926, when there began to be so many reports in the newspapers of rabbis named McLaughlin and O'Hara, who had suddenly found religion, that they could no longer keep that racket going. There were many other ways of getting it, and there were many ways of acquiring it. The saloon became the speakeasy, of course. We all know the speakeasy, but it was a totally different place because unlike the saloon, the speakeasy allowed women in. And that was the first time, other than the wealthy used to drink, men and women would drink in hotel restaurants together. But middle class and poor people, there was no place for them to drink together because the saloon was male only. Because the speakeasy lived outside the law, it lived outside of convention. Convention broke. It became exciting to go into to a speakeasy for a woman. And that led to change in the way that people drank in what we know as bars. Not only men and women drinking together, but you had to have table service because women bellying up to the bar wasn't a very attractive thing. You had, if you had men and women together, you had entertainment. There were no bands. There was no music in bars before 1920, not in legal bars at all. So the outlaw music, jazz, comes in, dancing comes in, and the modern nightclub is born. There were only men's rooms in the saloon. Why would there be anything but a men's room? There were not any women customers, but suddenly there was a need to have toilet facilities for women, and they would find a place underneath the stairwell or behind the bar or in a broom closet and convert it, this tiny room, put in a toilet and a sink, and that was the origin of the powder room, and the term powder room is born at that very same time. Also the private life at home. Malcolm Cowley, the literary critic Malcolm Cowley, returns from 3 years in Paris in 1923, and he discovers this thing called the cocktail party, which he had never heard of. People getting together in a private home for one purpose, to drink. That had not existed in pre-Prohibition culture. In any case, I'm going on rather long. I'll wrap it up now and take questions. I'll just wrap it up with how it ends, very briefly. Just as the things that brought Prohibition to pass didn't have a lot to do with drinking, and they had to do with the income tax, and they had to do with women's suffrage, and they had to do with World War I, the end of Prohibition similarly came about largely because of the Depression. In 1929, the market crashes, the Depression follows, incomes plummet, and the federal government is broke. The federal government, not only does it not have money to spend on relief programs to perhaps get out of the Depression, but it doesn't even have money to function. And people recognize that there is money to be had if you could only bring back beer and liquor. there were two primary groups that were agitating for this. One, Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, he gives a speech in Newark during the campaign pointing out that the federal government would be enriched by $250 million in the first year alone. And $250 million, today's money is about $5 or $6 billion, and it would have been a huge portion of the federal budget, would be enriched by that much simply by bringing back beer, much less hard liquor and wine. The other group, however, were, and this was very difficult for me as your basic New England liberal Democrat, the people who opposed Prohibition more than anybody else were the right wing, the wealthy, the plutocrats, the malefactors of great wealth, as the Roosevelts would call them. The repeal movement was paid for by the DuPont family, and particularly led by Pierre DuPont, the leader of the DuPont family. And I have letters in this book, some of which have never been published before, that I found. I love it. Rich people save everything, so you can go, if you spend enough time going through the archives at the DuPont family library in Wilmington, you'll find this stuff. Letters from Pierre DuPont to his brothers saying, if only we can get rid of this damnable prohibition, we can get rid of the damnable income tax, and the government won't be stealing our money from us anymore. So they first secretly and then very openly campaign to bring about an end to Prohibition because we need those dollars. Now, they supported Roosevelt and they supported the repeal movement, and then when Roosevelt did in fact lower income taxes for working people but not for rich people, they turned on him viciously, founded the Liberty League, which was the leading anti-Roosevelt organization, and kind of created a permanent right-wing class at that time. Finally, I think I've said finally 3 times, so maybe I ought to stop. But to me, the oddest thing of all, the greatest irony, is that it became harder to get a drink after the end of Prohibition than it had been during Prohibition. When you had no code of rules, of laws, nothing to say when you had to be open or closed, or whether you could be near a church, or whether there was an age limit, or whether you could sell on Sunday, when there was no license to be lost for somebody who was selling alcoholic beverages on a retail basis, he was sold to everybody. And a 12-year-old could walk in to a speakeasy in American City, on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock and get a shot if he wanted one. After repeal, the 21st Amendment in the second clause assigns to the states the responsibility for creating, for enforcing their own laws as they wish about alcohol consumption and sale. And that income, the age limits, and you can't be near a church, you can't be near a school, you have to close on Sunday. We still live with a lot of these things. And there was a license that could be lost if you violated those things, so that the people who were in the business of selling alcoholic beverages, they had to be very, very careful. Is there a lesson in that about marijuana? I'll leave that to somebody else to decide. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know a lot beyond that book about the anti-tobacco forces in that time, but I don't think they were religiously motivated, and I don't think they had that same fire that the religiously motivated anti-liquor people had, or, for that matter, the suffrage movement. I don't think that there was a connection. You didn't have a cigarette and then beat up your wife. There was, there was not the causality. So I expected that would have something to do with it. Also, interestingly, the political authority, the power of the distilleries and the breweries were very dispersed. It was a national industry. It wasn't concentrated in places like Kentucky, North Carolina, and Tennessee, where you had very powerful tobacco interests who had strong representation in Congress. It was a much, they didn't have the political clout. I think that would be the reason, yes. The thesis of my book is that you can't legislate against human appetite. I'm telling a story, fundamentally. I provide a narrative, and there are many arguments that I make. Yeah, I think it is. I would like to think that it is. For instance, I am an economic determinist, and I think that it is absolutely clear that Prohibition could not have happened without the income tax amendment, and that the two things were tied, or they don't seem to be tied. And I also think it is absolutely clear that Prohibition would not have been repealed without the need for revenue. But that's not the whole story. There's a lot of story. You're right. But I also think that it seems to me that the scientific evidence about the dangers of tobacco is much clearer than the scientific evidence against moderately consumed alcohol. I'm not here to make a case for moderate consumption. I'm not the liquor industry. But I can see very clearly, as the father of 2 and as an ex-smoker myself, that's poison, that stuff, and liquor isn't. It just isn't. The point about crime, there was organized crime before Prohibition, but it was very localized. There was a neighborhood in most cities controlled by mobsters, and that's where the prostitution, gambling, drugs, very clear, but they could stay local. When you needed to ship huge quantities of physical goods from one place to another, you needed to have allies somewhere else. So for instance, the Philadelphia mob, which specialized in taking industrial alcohol, which was legally produced under permits, the alcohol needed to make everything from explosives to aftershave to felt hats, the lead pencils. They would take that alcohol, which had been denatured, they would renature it, then they would flavor it. Usually, how do you make scotch in Philadelphia? You added creosote, which gave it a smoky flavor, and prune juice to color it. That was the primary color. Bottle it, put on a counterfeit label, and then you had many, many cases of it that needed to be shipped somewhere. And the Philadelphia mob, using the Erie Railroad, shipped to large cities in the Middle West. They needed people at the other end. Same in Chicago. The liquor in Chicago came from Detroit. Detroit was the faucet where the liquor poured from Canada. And the Purple Gang in Detroit made an alliance with the gangs in Chicago. They all came together in 1929 at the President Hotel in Atlantic City for a conference in which they created the National Crime Syndicate, where they divided up the country, where they set prices, where they gave each various responsibilities. It was a direct consequence of Prohibition, huge fortunes made, and then when Prohibition comes to an end, they have to do something with those fortunes. What businesses do they go into? Newspaper distribution. All those trucks were used to drop newspapers and paperback books around the country, and Las Vegas, which was founded by the Cleveland mob, Mo Dalitz and Bugsy Siegel of the New York mob, because they needed a new business to get into. Somebody else a question? Yes, sir. Joe Kennedy. Well, this is the last 5 pages of the book proper before the epilogue is about Joe Kennedy. The question that I've been asked more often than any other since I began working on it is, what about Joe Kennedy? What do you have on him? What I have on him is what I believe to be an extremely convincing argument, although not finally probative, that he wasn't a bootlegger at all. I know the story that you can't prove a negative. Maybe there's a scrap of evidence somewhere that indicates otherwise. The reason why we believe he was a bootlegger resides in a trip that he took in September of 1933 with Jimmy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's son, to the UK. And if you're traveling with the president's son, you can see pretty much anybody you want to see. And he saw the leaders of the Distillers Corporation Limited, which is the huge liquor trust in the UK. And he came back with a license to import into the United States, the exclusive license to import Dewar's, Hagen, and Gordon's under the name of Somerset Importers, named after the club on Beacon Street that would not have him as a member. But he had medicinal licenses. He had medicinal licenses that were granted him in Washington, and he imported the liquor into bonded warehouses beginning in late October, early November of 1933, 6 weeks ahead of repeal. When repeal arrives, suddenly he can sell that liquor, and the bond is taken off the warehouses, and he has trucks going out all over the country. So there's this association that's there. But then Kennedy has to get approved by the Senate for 3 appointments during the 1930s for the SEC job, the Maritime Commission, ambassadorship to Great Britain. And if you read the record, there is no mention at all anywhere in the congressional records or in any newspaper of the era, and I've searched all of them, thank God for ProQuest, and also for a wonderful librarian at the Globe, at a time when people had lots of reason to hate Joe Kennedy, when Prohibition was fresh in everybody's mind, when there were people, when drives were really angry, and no one even suggested the possibility that he had been one. In 1954, there's an article about Jimmy Roosevelt and his subsequent career in the Chicago Tribune, written by Walter Troen, the longtime Chicago bureau chief of the Tribune, in which he makes reference to this trip that they took and how Joe Kennedy was importing liquor into the U.S. during Prohibition. He does not say legally during Prohibition, which it was. Then nothing else appears in print until Jack Kennedy's presidential campaign. It begins to show up in a few places, and then after the assassination, when conspiracy theorists are looking for reasons why Sam Giancana or the mob would have killed Joe, then it starts to pop up, and you see it a lot. But if you go back before that period, no one had even suggested it. The evidence that shows up in books about the Kennedy family, about Joe Kennedy, I saw him standing on the dock in Gloucester as one of his boats was coming in. I mean, this guy, he controlled a huge stock brokerage. He owned a motion picture studio. He had starlet girlfriends. He's not standing on a dock waiting for a boat to come in. And there's one historian of the Kennedy family who says, though there's no evidence, there are so many stories, it must be true. And that's kind of discouraging. Anyway, that's the Joe Kennedy story at too much length. I apologize for that. Yes, sir. Even today, the liquor isn't federalized except for tax purposes. And so they use the tax laws to keep liquor, something like that, out of the country. It is controlled by the states, as the language of the 21st Amendment indicates, which is why we can't, in some states, can't buy wine from other states, can't have it shipped to us, why this is in front of the Supreme Court right now. In fact, Billie Holiday, what does Billie Holiday have to do with Prohibition? Billie Holiday had a drug arrest, a drug conviction, and it was under the New York City cabaret laws that they kept her from singing in cabarets after that conviction because liquor was served in cabarets. It was only, she could sing anywhere where liquor wasn't served. It was only the liquor law that made that restricted her. Yeah, as I said ad infinitum, women made Prohibition happen. In 1928, a woman named Pauline Morton Sabin, probably my favorite character in this book. She's an heiress to the Morton salt fortune from Chicago. Her father was in the Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft cabinet. She was one of the wealthiest women in New York. Her husband was a J.P. Morgan partner. She had a 300-acre estate and a 28-room house in Southampton, an estate. She was big stuff. She was the founder of the Women's National Republican Club, the first woman member of the Republican National Committee, a really esteemed and powerful figure. And in 1929, she had been for liquor, and then she saw how hypocritical it was. And I think she was genuine. She really believed this. And she began to think that it was a terrible thing and was counting on Herbert Hoover, who was really a progressive in many ways and certainly more enlightened than his two predecessors. Well, I shouldn't say that Warren Harding wasn't enlightened. He was too drunk to be enlightened most of the time. There's some great stuff about him. When Hoover gives his inaugural speech in March of 1929, and he refers to Prohibition as a noble experiment, he didn't quite say it in those words, but that was what was picked up from it. She decides she stops being a Republican and that she's going to fight to bring about repeal. She goes on a tour of the South with some of her lady friends who have last names like Schuyler, Pierpont, Van Rensselaer. It is the absolute cream of New York society. And they travel to Charleston and they travel to Atlanta and various other places. And all the junior league women in these towns all turn out because these are the most glamorous society women in America. They made it respectable for women to be against Prohibition and for repeal. And you could follow in their wake as they moved around the country how the opinion, at least publicly expressed opinion by women, changed. And they recruited over 1 million members. Now, a member meant just somebody signing a piece of paper, and it became an incredibly effective force, as much as anything else, to bring about repeal. Now, it's true that they were allied with the DuPonts. I mean, their husbands were all doing it for other reasons, but Sabin was the real thing. Was a great woman, I think. I've forgotten. Yes, sir. Well, the cultural aspects is that those I described, men and women drinking together and such, of course, and the idea of cocktail parties and the where and how it was served. But certainly in terms of quantity, this is very measurable. We don't know exactly how much people drank during Prohibition because there were no tax stamps, and that's how we've always measured it. The demographers who've done this, one of the interesting things they use cirrhosis as a trailing indicator. And you can see that the cirrhosis rates start dropping in the mid to late 20s and stay down and then don't come back until the late 30s. And that's one of the ways that these people have determined that alcohol consumption was down. But if you go back to the last pure year before Prohibition, which by my reckoning is 1914, before a lot of state prohibition laws have come into effect, we did not get back to that level of per capita alcohol consumption until the 1970s. Drinking really did go down. At the end of Prohibition and for the 10 or 15 years after, it was down about 30% from what it had been before Prohibition. It peaked in the 1970s. We're down somewhat from there.
Surely we don't drink as much as you described in the pre...
No, we did. Well, if we go back to the 1830s, no, we don't drink anywhere near. We drink about 40% of the 1830 consumption. But immediately pre-Prohibition, when we're comparing a similar population, an immigrated population, it stayed down. The brewers and the distillers have always hated each other. They always felt that each was destroying the other's business. The brewers saw they made the case that what they were producing was, they actually used the phrase liquid bread. I have photographs in here of a brochure from a brewery in Detroit with a child, a 2-year-old drinking beer because it's helpful for mother and child. And so they demonized the distillers. The distillers, meanwhile, are saying that the brewers, they own a lot of the saloons. So they have these The Tide House, very familiar in the UK, was the case here. On any intersection, if Pabst had a saloon here, then Bush went over here, and Rupert had one over on the next corner, and everything was provided to the saloon owner. If you serve our beer only, we'll give you all your fixtures, we'll do the art on the wall, we'll provide that famous thing, the free lunch. There was a free lunch in the 1890s until 1920. What was the free lunch? Sardines, sausages, clams, saltines, really salty food. And you would drink a lot of, George Ade, the humorist George Ade, said, the sardines were not simply fish, they were silent partners. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit distracted from what your point was. But just as there is the division today between what's considered hard drugs and marijuana, there was that division each side. Without trying to sound prejudiced in any way, if there were Protestants, there was likely an effort to ban alcohol. And in fact, in many of the northern Protestant countries, there was prohibition. Canada, for instance, I mean, we think of Canada as this place where all the liquor is coming from. As early as 1903, Prince Edward Island had prohibition laws, and then by 1916, all the provinces in Canada but one, Quebec, had outlawed the free retail sale of alcoholic beverages. Under the peculiar Canadian Constitution, they couldn't stop manufacture. So you could move your operation. If you were Sam Bronfman, you would move from Manitoba and go to Quebec, and then ship from Quebec back to Manitoba, or soon enough to New York and Boston to make your fortune. In Iceland had absolute prohibition installed in 1915, which ended because the Icelanders had been drinking Spanish red wine, and when they put in prohibition, the Spaniards said, we're going to stop buying your cod if you don't buy our wine, and that put an end to that. The three Scandinavian countries had different versions of it. In Sweden, you had to have a drinking license, an actual license that controlled it. Finland had absolute prohibition until 1931. Now, was it always followed? Not necessarily. The drinking routines of the UK, which never had a formal prohibition, even though David Lloyd George wanted one, the closing hours, that big hunk of the day where you're not allowed to drink, that was all part of the same, really, throughout the Western world, this movement toward prohibiting the consumption of alcoholic beverages or limiting it. Look, I mean, believe me, there are many reasons to hate Joe Kennedy. I could list them at great length. This just isn't one of them. Or maybe we should hate him because he wasn't a bootlegger. In any case, I've held you long enough. Thank you all for coming tonight.